A reading before the sermon. This is Spirit and Body Joined Together by Laura Horton Ludwig. Take a moment to breathe into the silence. Our breath is always with us. We can always come back to the breath, our anchor, our grounding, our freedom. Spirit of life and love, we are here, not just minds and hearts, but bodies too. We human beings, spirit and body joined together. On this day, we send out a prayer or a wish that every person, every being may be safe and well in body and spirit. May every person be well, and may we treat every person with respect and kindness and love. On this day, when we consider the connections between our bodies and our spirits, we lift up our hope and aspiration that all people will live in freedom to give and guard their bodies as seems best to them, and to exercise our own powers of moral discernment around their fertility and creative potential. May we remember that it is especially challenging for those who are living in poverty to exercise these rights, and may our society support them in every way possible. We say a special prayer for all those who have experienced violence or abuse, or any other form of damage to their being, which is so precious. May they know safety and healing. For all of us, may our physical being be a source of delight and well-being as we live in this world. May every being be safe and well in body and in spirit. May every person be well, and may we be vessels of compassion for everyone we meet. Amen. This fall, I preached about the tactics of fascist politics and how they are affecting our country and even our congregations. I have drawn heavily from Jason Stanley's How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, and the Reverend Cecilia Kingman's 2023 Berry Street essay, My Little Pony Was Right, Fascisms Without and Within. Today, we are going to do a bit of a deep dive into exploring the tactic Stanley calls sexual anxiety, interconnected with others. Quick recap, there are 10 tactics in total, all of which feed off of and into each other and are used to divide us further. The 10 are a mythic past, propaganda, anti-intellectualism, unreality, hierarchy, victimhood, law and order, sexual anxiety, Sodom and Gomorrah, urban versus rural, and Arbeit macht frei, work shall make you free, othering through standards and ideals about what work looks like, including tearing into labor unions that bring people together across class. Sexual anxiety builds a bunch off of the ideas of hierarchy, that is, traditional patriarchal roles and structures like having a man as head of household and primary breadwinner. Hierarchy is dependent on the ideals of heteronormativity and heterosexual marriage, man and wife, and the desire to have this model replicated at all levels of society. When the man in power, the nation's leader, is viewed as the father of the nation, only I can protect you. Only I can fix this. I think we've heard those things before. The image is one of strength. Any threat to patriarchal manhood and the traditional, that is, heteronormative family is a threat to the leader's image as strong. This absolutely includes queer and LGBTQIA+ folks, single women, and so-called non-traditional family arrangements, and makes it so that they need to be quashed or eliminated because their existence undermines that single story of strength and leader as father. We've seen this pointedly in US history with the untrue claims of rape by Black men and boys of white women and girls. Lynchings happened regularly because of these false claims. White people in general have believed that rape was a common problem and was with a justifiable outcome because, as Stanley writes, that would make rational sense of the fear and anxiety they felt over a potential loss of status associated with accepting their Black fellow citizens as equals. That is, distress about one thing, especially one that's unacceptable to be openly distressed about, is redirected at something else that is more acceptable. We also saw this with our current president's famous early campaign propaganda last time about Mexican immigrants crossing the border who he called rapists. This rhetoric was taken as truth by people across the country and used to vilify immigrants, and still is, of whatever non-white origin, including children and refugees. Often these are people coming to this country because our politics or economics have done something that they feel they need to leave their homes. The US doesn't have exclusive rights on this tactic. Stanley references the ethnic cleansing assault in Myanmar and the Rohingya people, a minority Muslim population. It has also been seen in Europe with accusations of Middle Eastern men raping white women. It is seen repeatedly throughout the world, and I'm sure it is a claim that has been used by Jewish Israelis against Palestinians. Again, where there is already stress and anxiety in a system like the American populace, due to any single or group of factors, take, for example, politics, economics, the price of eggs, and name whatever you want, this tactic gets used against a variety of groups. This is one reason we've seen so much demonization of trans folks, with the introduction of bathroom bills, as one example, that require people, including children, to only use the bathroom that correlates with their sex assigned at birth on their birth certificates. The argument has been that trans folks are sexual predators and sexual deviants. This connects with Stanley's identified tactic of law and order. We make certain categories of people illegal so that we understand the created need to protect ourselves from them. So we create a group of people so that we feel like we have something to defend against, even if it's not necessarily, or especially when it's not real. This also relies on individuals to do the policing of spaces like bathrooms, which is a whole separate concern that we don't have time to get into today. Trans women are especially targeted because of the belief that they have chosen femininity, which threatens patriarchal ideals of roles. Stanley quotes from Julia Serrano's book, Whipping Girl. She writes, "In a male-centered gender hierarchy where it is assumed that men are better than women and that masculinity is superior to femininity, there's no greater perceived threat than the existence of trans women who, despite being male and inheriting male privilege, choose to be female instead. By embracing our own femaleness and femininity, we, in a sense, cast a shadow of doubt over the supposed supremacy of maleness and masculinity. In order to lessen the threat we pose to the male-centered gender hierarchy, our culture, primarily via the media, uses every tactic in its arsenal of traditional sexism to dismiss us." So we see this idea of needing to protect women and children creates within the system, which could be the nation, a particular population, a city, a town, or a family, a need for safety. This need for safety then gives more leverage to those in positions of power to take more power in order to ensure the safety of the vulnerable and the majority. This can undermine democratic and liberal ideals without explicitly doing or saying anything against them, instead effectively creating a workaround that does the same thing. The leader takes more power in the name of keeping us safe and thereby reduces our civil liberties. Sound familiar? Further, freedom and equality become threats themselves. Abortion, gender expression, and other matters are practices of freedom, the issues that women and children need to be protected from in an authoritarian world. Women's equality and any matter that may create an image of male helplessness or victimhood, which is another of Stanley's tactics, is seen as threatening through this lens. Essentially, anyone who isn't controlled by a man or a man's choices is seen as a threat to the system and its leader. I feel so good right now. We are already seeing through just these examples how multiple fascist tactics are being used. There's the mythic past of a time when we all knew the traditional family roles and embodied them, when our perceptions of life seemed one way, regardless of whether that was one way for many people. Propaganda as a way to spread division and further separate groups from each other. Anti-intellectualism, preventing accurate information from being easily accessible and used in education. This is where and why we've canned all diversity, equity, and inclusion measures in a variety of settings. Unreality, as many of the claims we hear about aren't true, again, looping back to the rape accusations. Hierarchy. Victimhood comes into play when, in these examples, men feel like they can't live in their proper roles as providers and protectors, and therefore consider themselves victims of this supposed threat. This is also where we get people saying things like, why don't we have straight or white pride month? Law and order would be when marginalized people are attacked and assaulted and even killed as a way to keep a family or community safe, and when their personhood is legislated against. This is why we honor Trans Day of Remembrance and other holidays. Sexual anxiety as a redirection of other anxieties, but that are considered an appropriate expression of anxiety. We're mad about the price of eggs and other groceries, but where can we express that anger? Evidently trans people, because, you see the correlation, right? And even Sodom and Gomorrah, because this is the kind of thing that can happen in cities, centers of sin, and if it were to happen in the country, they would just take matters into their own hands. Last year, I was able to attend Meadville Lombard's spring convocation and got to hear my colleague, Reverend Jim Foti, preach an iteration of his Skinner Award-winning sermon for 2023, Resisting Tyranny. Among the many points he raised, one that particularly struck me is the fact that we hear so much vitriol about the threat of the trans community, which in the US and also worldwide is only about 0.6% of the population. I will say that after reviewing data since that information was accurate at the time, but in a more nuanced understanding today is that this is more accurate for older Americans. While younger Americans, especially younger millennials and younger, represent a little bit higher percentage, probably closer to 1.5% or more. So just for an idea of how many people we're talking about, the percentage of natural redheads in the US is about 4%. This percentage that Foti quoted was about the trans population in the US is somewhat comparable to the Jewish population in Germany at the start of World War II, which was at about 0.75%. A tiny, often misunderstood minority can become a scapegoat under authoritarian leadership, especially when religion, or presumably other charged identities like sexuality or gender, can be used to reinforce concerns, beliefs, and misconceptions. Florida's legislative session doesn't begin until March 4th this year, and somehow there aren't a lot of bills on the table yet this term for the Florida Congress. But if we look at last year's, it's no surprise that a number of them that were considered were directed specifically at the LGBTQ+ community, sex ed, and bodily autonomy. S1120 is the so-called flag ban bill that seeks to ban public buildings from raising or displaying flags that represent a political viewpoint, like Pride or Black Lives Matter flags. This is a bill on the table again for the House and the Senate to consider this year. One of the concerns about this is that individuals in government buildings may not even be able to express their own personal views, regardless of whether or not the buildings themselves express these views. H1135 is a bill that threatens to restrict information on preventing STDs and unwanted pregnancies for minors and threaten to deny them access to LGBTQ+ content because it is considered grooming. That bill did not pass. H1233 and H1639, which were the so-called trans erasure bills, which would require individuals to have their identification, license, or other state issued, use their sex assigned at birth and not their gender identity under threat of revocation of their license or ID. These did not pass, but those have become an executive order that's gone into effect and has been preventing trans people from getting their passports renewed and sometimes other documentation as well. H 1291 would prevent teacher preparation programs from educating about identity politics, including courses based on theories that systemic racism, sexism, oppression, and privilege are inherent in the institutions of the United States and were created to maintain social, political, and economic inequalities. That bill did pass. H 651 and S 476 targeted abortion providers, abortion-seeking patients, and people who help them by allowing lawsuits for wrongful death of an unborn child, and would have allowed partners or ex-partners to potentially seek damages, including for survivors of domestic violence, which is why this bill was being referred to as the Abuser Empowerment Act. Thankfully, those did not pass. And H 415 and S 436, which would require the Florida Department of Health to create a website using a third-party vendor that features anti-abortion pregnancy centers. That did pass in the House. The effort to overturn the 6-week abortion ban bill failed last year, even though the majority of Floridians supporting it being overturned, even though there was a majority of Floridians who supported it being overturned, and the 6-week ban went into effect on May 1st, 2024. If you want to know more about what's happening this year, my wonderful friend and colleague, Jess Martinez-Hunt, will be here on March 13th for our forum to talk about the challenges of being trans in Florida and what people are doing to resist. What we may fail to understand about these bills and the general atmosphere of living in a state where education and freedom and equity are not valued is that it makes all of us less safe in practice. It turns out that STDs are spread and pregnancies happen regardless of whether or not you know the science, and the most effective way to understand how to prevent or minimize them is through education. There's a famous black and white picture with a big pile of books that's being burned that I'm sure that you've seen. That image is from 1933 Nazi Germany, and while it has often been used as emblematic of Nazi philosophy, I need you to know that what was being burned was the entire library of the Institute of Sexology, founded in 1919 by Magnus Hirschfeld. The Institute served and treated thousands of LGBTQIA+ patients and advocated for understanding and education regarding LGBTQIA+ folks. During Nazi rule, thousands of queer people were sent to concentration camps, and even more were arrested and subjected to cruel treatment. After the end of World War II, the article in German law that criminalized homosexuality was not repealed, and many gay folks continued to be persecuted and imprisoned for years. Queer and LGBTQIA+ folks in the United States still have poorer health outcomes in some categories, including those related to reproductive organs and systems, because some healthcare providers and or healthcare systems are not informed or choose to ignore the very real challenges of this community, including how to care for them as individuals and what to be aware of when caring for them. The thing is that abstinence-only education and other education strategies like not teaching or making available information about sex and sexuality actually harms us all. Children and youth who are educated on the variety of ways that sex and sexuality can be expressed tend to engage in sexual activity later than their peers who have not, and they have made better decisions about what and how and with whom to engage in these activities. Education is even more important for those with marginalized identities, whether disabilities or based on gender identity or sexual attraction. For example, I know lesbians who didn't realize that until they were older that they'd had sex or had been assaulted because the sexual activity that they had had didn't look like the birds and the bees when a man and a woman fall in love that they had been taught. Good sex ed teaches about the many ways that we can engage in sexual activities, about the vitality of consent and enthusiastic consent at that, and about the challenges of relationships, including how to have conversations about sex. It also matters for the feelings and emotions that may come up around sexual activity and its consequences, as well as navigating information from reliable sources. Not everyone goes for regular screenings, in part because not everyone understands the importance of doing so, because many haven't had good sex ed. So here's a reminder that whatever parts you have, get them checked. It matters. All of our bodies are equally deserving of care from ourselves and those who help and support us in our life journeys, especially those in medical professions. We all deserve to have choices about how and when our bodies are cared for and to be treated with dignity and respect. We all deserve access to good information that helps us make good decisions about how we care for ourselves and help keep us safe. I can't say what the future holds, but I feel really confident these next 4 years are going to be a rough ride. And I take heart from the resistance I see happening and pray it continues. Together, we can help us all get what we need to take good care of the blessings of our bodies, that they may continue to bless us for years to come. And may we remember that we are all far more interconnected than we might realize, and that what is good for the most marginalized of us will benefit us all.